Mr. President and members of the board, I thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of myself and hundreds of others in whose trust they have placed me to represent their wishes and concerns. Before I begin and introduce myself, let me describe a place, a very real place, a place where men, women, and sometimes children are abused, neglected, ill-treated, raped, and sometimes murdered. Sometimes these people are denied food, medical care, access to proper clothing. They are slapped, punched, kicked, electrocuted with tasers, gassed with OC pepper spray, taunted, threatened with violence, sexual assault, and other things too numerous and horrible to mention. They are subjected to long periods of sleep deprivation, oftentimes in extremely cold or excruciatingly hot confinement areas. Some of the people who complain or file complaints are placed on mock suicide watches in solitary confinement without access to telephones, attorneys, or postal mail privileges, often for weeks at a time. This systematic and illegal abuse is perpetrated by a posse of corrupt, nefarious, and unscrupulous group of government officers bent on personal greed and an emotional need to enlarge their own lacking self-esteem by degrading and abusing those that are less fortunate than themselves. What is this place, you might ask? Is it a Nazi concentration camp, a Soviet gulag, a recurring Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay secret torture prison? I assure you that this place has certainly been compared to the worst that Hitler and Joseph Stalin could have ever implemented in their terrible regimes of oppression. Sadly, the place that I'm referring to is a lot closer to home. It is right here in Madison County, Mississippi. Closer to home or not, it does not detract from the fact that the Madison County Detention Center is one of the worst, most inhumane, and inefficiently operated jails in the country. And that is why I stand before you here today to offer a first-hand account of the corruption, the malfeasance, and the atrocities I witnessed while incarcerated in this place that you refer to as the county jail. My name is David Atwood, and I am from Vicksburg, Mississippi. I am a published author and an activist for criminal justice reform. I was incarcerated in the federal prison system for almost 5 years on a charge in which I maintained my innocence and, in my opinion, was wrongly convicted. From January 2010 till the end of April, I was detained in the Madison County, Mississippi jail on a minor federal probation violation. Knowing that I would have to spend several months in that place, and knowing of the abuse and corruption that takes place there, I undertook a mission to document, record, and otherwise report on what I and many others consider to be an axis of horrors. Under such state laws as Section 47-1-27, 47-1-29, 47-131, the Board of Supervisors and the impaneled grand juries of Madison County, Mississippi have jurisdiction to investigate and punish sheriffs and jail guards who mistreat, abuse, and neglect county prisoners. The time has passed for indifference and impassiveness. If America is to reclaim her moral authority as a defender of human rights and dignity, it must start at the local level. Because we are judged not by how we treat those in positions of wealth and power, but by how we treat those who are less fortunate than ourselves. According to the Geneva Conventions and organizations specializing in human rights and the treatment of prisoners, incarcerated persons are entitled in all circumstances to respect for their persons, their honor, their family rights, their religious convictions and practices, and their manners and customs. And they should at all times be humanely treated and should be protected especially against all acts of violence or threats thereof, and against insults and abuse. In the Madison County Jail, outrageous staff brutality and degrading treatment of inmates is the rule rather than the exception. In recent times, the abuse has become so common that the federal government is currently seeking other facilities to house their pretrial detainees. The physical and psychological abuse that takes place there is beyond description, but perhaps I can open a small window into what is certainly some of the most worst allegations to come forth from that cesspool. The administrator there, Chuck McNeil, specifically recruits and manages a group of correctional guards within the jail, known in prison slang as the Goon Squad. They consider themselves more highly trained and physically superior to most any other guards or inmates. Their manner and dress is modeled on that of the German Gestapo. Their sole purpose is to maintain order and enforce discipline within the jail. Their MO is obedience through violence. Their sadistic actions are recorded on their personal cell phones and replayed over and over for their amusement and laughter. Lieutenant Alexander, a man of short stature but tall ego, is Chuck McNeil's leader and chief enforcer. Sergeant Hathcock follows in behind Alexander, along with Officer Abels and Officer Benjamin Blaine. I have personally witnessed this group of testosterone-driven egos physically assault, taser, and gas inmates without just cause other than a personal dislike. They live and breathe for the opportunity to assert their power, often at the expense of an inmate's well-being. Lieutenant Perry, a woman promoted beyond her capabilities and certainly beyond her understanding of the job entrusted to her, has a personal hatred of any inmate that comes to their doors. Lieutenant Perry's disregard for the inmate's well-being has caused many inmates to be assaulted and severely hurt. I watched several effeminate, gay inmates beg to be moved to protective custody because of threats of rape and assault. Lieutenant Perry stood by and told them that bad things happen in prison. One of those gay inmates was later assaulted. Officer Bell, a woman with known connections to the Vice Lord Street Gang, has numerous times in full view of other inmates grabbed and fondled on the private parts of male inmates. In one instance, Officer Bell made arrangements for sexual rendezvous with an inmate who was being released back into society. Officer Bell on one occasion denied me several food trays for my reporting of her illegal behavior. Officer Watson Jackson, on numerous occasions, has orchestrated the assault of inmates he has taken a dislike to. Officer Ware, a man which, in my belief, has homosexual tendencies, subjects inmates to unnecessary and to frequent strip searches for no other apparent reason than to see them nude. My stepfather is an attorney, and after filing numerous complaints with Chuck McNeil, Sheriff Toby Trowbridge, and Captain Brian Watson about the abuse, neglect, and corruption I witnessed, was denied access to attorney visits with me. For my own part, as punishment for filing the complaints, I was placed in a medical holding cell for several weeks on the mock suicide watch, without any clothes, no access to phones to call my attorneys, no access to my mail or legal work. They fed me a reduced calorie meal, kept me in pitch black darkness for days, refused to allow me to shower, brush my teeth, or do the most simplistic things. I was not given a blanket or a mattress to sleep on. I was basically so isolated there would be no way that I could communicate with anyone, family or attorneys. Again, this is the norm at Madison County Jail, not the exception. Abusive officers do not operate in a vacuum. More typically, a culture of brutality has developed in which correctional officers know they can get away with excessive, unnecessary, or even purely malicious violence. In such prisons, senior officials have failed to communicate unequivocally through training, staff supervision, investigations, and discipline that abuse will not be tolerated. Most of the men and women who work in U.S. jails are decent professionals who have never physically abused or intentionally degraded an inmate, but the absence of leadership, oversight, and external scrutiny can create a climate in which abuses will occur. The failure of senior officials in the Madison County Jail are compounded by the absence of external scrutiny. Prisons and jails are closed institutions from which the press, human rights groups, and members of the public are typically excluded. Independent expert inspections yielding public findings are rare and usually occur only after the situation has become so bad that inmates have filed a lawsuit. It has reached that level now. Perhaps if photos or videotapes of abuse in the Madison County, Mississippi jail were to circulate publicly, citizens would be galvanized to protest such treatment. Absent such graphic and unavoidable evidence, it is all too likely that abuse will continue to be part of many of the inmates' sentences. Abuse becomes systematic and widespread when officials deny its significance as a psychologically and physically devastating abuse that undercuts the very purpose of imprisonment. When jail guards abuse prisoners in their charge, they commit a crime that is condoned by the silence of their colleagues, the tactical neglect of elected officials, and the apathy of the American public. Sheriff Toby Trowbridge should at most be held criminally responsible for his purposeful neglect of the conditions, abuse, and corruption that he allows and probably encourages at the jail. His willful neglect to investigate allegations of corruption and prisoner abuse reflect far more than just his personal feelings. It reflects his contempt of those he deems less fortunate than himself. His willful neglect to advocate installation of video recording devices throughout the entire jail, and especially in the housing units, only goes to show that neither does he care for an adequate system for deterrence of inmate-on-inmate assaults, but more importantly, he wishes to avoid any system that might reveal the extent of his officers' behavior and assaults on the inmates that are housed in his jail. It is essential to seriously investigate all allegations of corruption and prisoner abuse, but just as importantly, a system should be implemented where independent oversight can be introduced to the jail and regular reports be made on what, if any, conditions are being approved. Sheriff Trowbridge and his correctional guard should stand up and let justice be done upon them and submit to recognized international guidelines on humane and proper treatment of the inmates under their care. As the original hero of human rights, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." Thank you for your time, and I hope that by my being here today and standing up for something that I consider to be one of the biggest injustices in our lives will not go unheeded. It is time to send a message that inmates in the Madison County, Mississippi jail will no longer be mistreated, abused, and neglected. Thank you.